Okay, well, we'll probably have some people joining us as we get going. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our third webinar, as I said, in the workshop and webinar series on better vaccine conversations. The way that this workshop and webinar series works is that our webinars are typically pretty lecture oriented, and then our workshops are really hands-on, and often the two will sort of pair up nicely so that there's some content in the webinar that it provides the background for what you practice during the workshop. And so for context, we know that at home, at work, and in virtual meeting spaces like this one, Alaskans are tackling challenging conversations about the COVID-19 vaccine all the time, whether we're figuring out how to come back to the office after Omicron, navigating childcare, or planning family gatherings. Talking about vaccination provokes really powerful feelings about our safety, our health, our freedom, our autonomy, and our responsibilities to the communities that we care for. It's really easy for conversations to become heated quickly for those reasons. Sometimes it's faulty assumptions, other times it's loaded words that push the relationship into a vicious cycle of defensiveness, mistrust, and hostility. And so that's exactly what we're going to be tackling today, is how do you set boundaries so that you can more effectively address that kind of dynamic, and how can we do better? So today, we're going to be focusing specifically on constructive boundary setting. And so we'll start by talking about the what and the why of boundaries. Then we'll dig into how you identify boundaries, how you know when you have a boundary that you want to articulate, how to communicate those boundaries, how to manage the aftermath when you have communicated your boundaries, because there inevitably will be some discomfort. And then we'll just review the upcoming webinars and workshops and have some time for questions and answers. So the Alaska Humanities Forum has developed this series in partnership with the Alaska Children's Trust, with funding from the United Way and the Municipality of Anchorage's Health Department. So a quick caveat, the opinions, findings, and recommendations expressed in these presentations are those of the Alaska Humanities Forum. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the United Way of Anchorage or the Municipality of Anchorage's Health Department. Some of you may already be familiar with our work. For those of you who aren't, we have this short video to give you a little bit of context about who we are and how we think about the work of strengthening communities. And you'll see that we put conversation at the center of that community building work.
The world is so fast-paced now that there's not a lot of space to just sit and actually listen.
The problems that we face aren't simple. They're layered, they're nuanced.
We get into silos of people who think like us.
And that's what we often ignore. We try to solve problems in a technical way. We try to work around humans and tackle really complex issues. But at the heart of the issue and at the heart of the solution is people. One of the ways that we can build community is through stories. And at the Humanities Forum, what we do with those stories is we use them as our tool. The tool to connect people, a tool to bridge differences. If you really want to strengthen communities, you have to tackle relationships. We play the role of convening, creating that space.
A place where people and ideas could come together.
To talk about and work on the issues that are most important in our community.
conversations that are actually thought-provoking and that matter.
Imagine if we could work through those things.
The value is bringing such diversity together.
Share values or views of the world.
If you step away from what you think you're supposed to say in a conversation,
you just can't help but have your ideas be influenced and informed by other people's ideas.
open up your mind, and that's how you really connect with people.
It opens us up to be interested in why people are the way they are.
Shared experiences create relationships, and those relationships are what solutions are built on.
And relationships aren't something short term.
You cannot make community in a single quarter of a single year.
Our work is all about the long game.
I think that's really what's going to change our communities.
It sounds soft, but it's not.
It changes the path to what's possible.
It's the work that can actually change societies.
You start to think about future generations and what their experience is going to be.
We have the opportunity now to change history. We do, and I think we're going to do it.
Then let's have a conversation. What do we want to build?
Okay, so with that, we also want to acknowledge that we are facilitating from Jayetnu, Anchorage, the current and ancestral homelands of the Dena'ina people. I am Megan Cassiola. I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Alaska Humanities Forum, and with me today is Odd Ples, who is the workshops coordinator. And so with that, let me just walk through our workshop goals. So as I mentioned during the agenda, we're going to start by talking about what boundaries are and why we need to understand our boundaries. Then we're going to learn how to identify our boundaries, specifically within the context of vaccine conversations, and then learn how to communicate our boundaries and manage the aftermath. And one of the things that came up in the video about the Alaska Humanities Forum is that we find it important to play the long game. And I think that that's going to be a theme throughout this presentation, because setting boundaries is really about playing the long game for yourself. And that's because, generally speaking, you set boundaries for the long-term benefits of what it does for your relationships, for your sense of self, and so forth. And the reason why we often fail to set those boundaries is because the truth is, setting boundaries in the short term creates a lot of discomfort. And a lot of times there will be difficult things that you have to deal with as a result of setting boundaries. So I want to just put that forward, that there's short-term discomfort for the purpose of long-term advantages. So what are boundaries? Nedra Glover Tawwab is the author of a book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And I love the way that she frames boundaries as being a gateway to better relationships. And she describes boundaries in a lot of different ways: a safeguard to overextending yourself, a way of communicating your needs to others. They're the parameters for knowing what to expect in relationships, and a way to create clarity, a way to feel safe. And importantly, they are honest. When you are clear about your boundaries, you are honest both with yourself and with the people that you are in relationship with. And we would all love to believe that we are endless fountains of time, energy, and just positive vibes. But the truth is that we all have limits. And when we are clear about those limits, we are able to build reciprocal trust. When we're unclear with about those limits, a lot of times that will not only cause us to the other person to lose trust in us, it will cause us to lose trust in the other person. Our own inability to set boundaries can reduce our trust in other people. And it helps us to define roles and relationships. And the fact of the matter is that boundaries are inevitable. We are all limited. And because we are limited, we have boundaries. So there are different levels of boundaries that you might have depending on how clear you are about your relationship boundaries, your limits as a human being. You could have porous boundaries, and porous boundaries mean that you are inconsistent about communicating your needs and your limitations. And so you may say that you need something, but you let it go later. You say you can't do something, but then you convince yourself that you can. And porous boundaries oftentimes lead to a lot of burnout and resentment. The flip side of that is rigid boundaries. And rigid boundaries are often a reaction to a situation where either you've for a long time had really porous boundaries, or people around you have taken advantage of flexibility. And so as a result of that past, you set extremely rigid and strict boundaries that are inflexible. And rigid boundaries are as destructive to our relationships and to our ability to, honor our own needs as porous boundaries are. Sometimes we might think that by setting really, really strict boundaries, we're being true to ourselves, but a lot of times that rigidity is just as damaging to us as it is to the relationships around us. And then, of course, in between those two things are healthy boundaries, which is what we are all seeking to develop with regards to our lives. And in this particular workshop, healthy boundaries around vaccine conversations. And there are 4 components of a boundary. So you have to be aware of what your limits are. Then you have to communicate it effectively. You have to hold that boundary through taking action. If you do not follow up your boundary with action, then it will become porous and it will cease to be a boundary. It will be taken advantage of. And then follow through, because boundaries oftentimes need to be consistently refreshed over and over and over again. So what does a boundary actually sound like? It sounds like you communicating your needs and expectations and your limitations. So it might sound like I need, I expect, or with limitations, it might be no, or please stop. It's pretty straightforward. These are what your boundaries sound like when you are communicating them explicitly. So when it comes to vaccine conversations, there's 3 places where these boundaries come up. So the first is the actual vaccine-related behaviors and choices. And so this might be, for instance, a decision whether or not to be vaccinated. a decision whether or not to get a child vaccinated. It could be a decision about whether or not to travel with someone or to visit someone who is unvaccinated. It could be a decision about how to host a gathering at your house and what parameters you want to put upon the guests at that gathering. It could be about your decision to go to somebody else's gathering. So all of those are direct vaccine-related behaviors and choices. And you have needs, you have expectations, and you have limitations with regards to those behaviors and choices. Then there are the conversational behaviors, because when you are communicating about your vaccine-related choices and decisions, there are certain behaviors that come up during the conversation itself that will elicit your needs, expectations, and your limitations. And so, for instance, if you've been arguing with a family member over vaccination for weeks, at some point, you may just become exhausted by having the same conversation over and over again. That is a limitation. You may find that somebody insults you, insults your values, or insults your reasoning in coming to the decisions that you have. You want to place a limit on you need to feel like you're being respected in the conversation. And so that's a boundary that you're feeling within the conversational behaviors about the vaccine. And then the other thing that comes up is that we've got a changing landscape of the virus itself and the information we have about the virus and about the vaccine for that matter. And that changing landscape will mean that your boundaries may shift over time. Other people's boundaries may shift over time. And so you need to be constantly reflecting on where your boundaries are, whether they have shifted, and how you communicate those to other people. Nedra Glover Tawwab said, healthy boundaries are possible when your past doesn't show up in your present interactions. And so this is when we're talking about our past not showing up in our present interactions, what we mean is that we are open to the possibility of something different happening. And so rigid boundaries happen when we feel like somebody has taken advantage of us in the past. And so we try to set this super firm, super clear, rigid wall up barrier in order to say, nope, I'm not going to let that happen again. And sometimes your boundaries will lead you to end a relationship. But if you have not ended the relationship at this point, then a healthy boundary means that you're communicating your needs and your expectations and kind of opening yourself up to whatever happens when you communicate that. A porous boundary means that you're so worried that the other person is not going to handle your need, expectation, or limitation well, that you second guess yourself and prevent yourself from having, from even thinking that you can have that boundary. So what are some signs that you might need boundaries with regards to vaccine conversations? Well, one is that you regularly feel like you're uncomfortable with the level of risk that you're taking. So if you feel like you're always taking more risk than you actually feel comfortable with, then you probably haven't set effective, constructive boundaries with regards to risk. And risk is always a calculation. It's something your risk assessment is going to vary compared to another person's. But if you don't feel comfortable with the level of risk that you're taking, that's an indication that you need to set clearer boundaries. Another is that you feel resentment towards other people's requests and expectations. If you are feeling resentment, one of the, we often think of certain emotions as bad or negative. Emotions just are. And when we're talking about resentment, one of the beautiful aspects of the feeling, the emotion of resentment is that it's telling you a message. It's telling you that there's a boundary you need to set that you haven't effectively set yet. And so if you feel like other people are or taking advantage of you, if you're feeling the sense of resentment, then maybe you haven't set a clear enough boundary at this point. If you're avoiding phone calls and interactions, that's a sign that you need boundaries. If you make comments about how you're accommodating others and getting nothing or very little in return, then again, you likely need some boundaries. And so you hear this with vaccine conversations when somebody says, you know, like, I've bent over backwards to do everything in order for my child to play with this other child, and their family just keeps on asking for all of these things, and I just don't understand. They don't do anything in return. That's an indication that there's a boundary that is missing, that has not been effectively communicated. Okay, so that's the what and the why of boundaries. But how do you know exactly what your boundaries are? A lot of times we feel a sense of uncertainty or doubt about our boundaries. Where exactly are our limits? Can we do more? Should we do more than we're already doing? These are the sorts of things that we grapple with. So again, some clues that you have a boundary are: number one, when you feel a sense of resentment, that is a clue to you that there's a boundary out there that you need to identify and you need to articulate. And so if you're feeling resentment, it can be a good opportunity to take a moment and reflect, whether that's just in your own head or if it's through journaling. When you're feeling that resentment, it is usually an indication that there's a boundary that is being crossed for you. And so it can be an opportunity to sit and think about what exactly is happening that I don't like. What is an expectation that I have that isn't being met? What's a need that I have that isn't being met? Or what's a limitation that I have that I am exceeding? I'm allowing myself to exceed. Respect, on the other hand, is an indication that somebody is really honoring a boundary that you have in some way. If you feel respected, then that can indicate that there's some boundary that you have that is really being taken seriously by the other person. And so sometimes a person just knows or intuits where your boundary is, and that feels really, really good. And so you can oftentimes recognize where you have a boundary by reflecting on what is this person that I have a really good relationship with doing that another person isn't? And what need are they fulfilling? What expectation are they fulfilling? What limitation are they accepting of that other people aren't necessarily? And then the last piece that can be helpful for helping you to identify your boundaries is when you're reflecting on both of these things, remove the sense of consequence. So, for instance, a lot of times our barriers to acknowledging our own boundaries is that we are afraid of how other people are going to react or respond. We think this person is going to get really, really angry, or we start to worry about the emotions that we're going to feel. I'm going to feel really sad about the fact that I can't help this person if I communicate to them that I am limited in my ability or willingness to see them when they're unvaccinated or something like that. So if you remove the consequence, if you imagine, like, what if I didn't have to worry about their reaction? What if I didn't have to worry about the idea that I might be letting somebody down? If you remove the sense of consequence from the calculation, what would you do in that situation? How, like, where would your limitation be? What would your need be if you didn't have to worry about how somebody else would react? I say this because this will help you identify your boundaries. But the fact is that there often are consequences. And so you're thinking in this what if world. But those consequences are real. So I don't want to pretend like they don't actually exist, but you're just going to remove them in your mind in order to figure out, what are your boundaries? What is your ideal world? Okay, so why don't we already have great constructive boundaries? So a lot of times we say to ourselves that they're the person who needs to change. They're asking too much of me. And they're the one who needs to realize that they should just stop doing that. Or they're the person that needs to understand more about the health and wellness community consequences of vaccination. Another thing that happens is we say, well, I tried to tell them that I couldn't do this and it didn't work. I tried to set a boundary, it didn't work. I told my mom that I couldn't visit her. I couldn't visit her because she wasn't vaccinated. I told my friend that I wasn't comfortable traveling with them because they're not vaccinated. Or I told my friend to stop asking me when I'd get vaccinated because I don't want to have that conversation over and over again. And they kept doing it anyway. And so we don't have a boundary because we tried something once, it didn't work, and so we give up. Another is that idea that there are going to be consequences. What if the person gets angry? I feel selfish or guilty holding a boundary. Like, oh, my mom really wants to visit with my kids, but I don't feel comfortable until my kids can get vaccinated. And so I feel like I'm withholding the visits, and I feel selfish and guilty for holding that boundary. That can be a big reason why we don't set a boundary. Another is, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I try to communicate it, but I end up upsetting them in some way, or I say something that I regret? All of these things hold us back. And more importantly, they hold us back from even recognizing where we have boundaries, because these things become so big in our minds, we can't even allow ourselves to admit that we're uncomfortable with a need or an expectation or a limitation not being met. So when we're setting boundaries, one of the things to be aware of is that you only set boundaries around your own behaviors. You describe your needs and expectations, but you can't control their choices. So when a boundary is not that your mom needs to get vaccinated. A boundary is that you need something, and if that doesn't happen, your behavior is going to be XYZ. And so you can't say, Mom, my boundary is that you get vaccinated. But you can say that your boundary is that you don't feel comfortable visiting her if she doesn't get vaccinated, right? And so your behaviors, your choices are what you are setting boundaries around. And oftentimes that's in response to what other people are doing, but you have to let go of the idea that you can control their choices and behaviors. That would be a violation of their boundaries. So to dig in a little bit deeper, sometimes boundaries collide. Sometimes your boundary is in conflict with somebody else's boundary. And so, for instance, your need or expectation might be that I need you to be vaccinated to feel safe around you. And their needs and expectations could be that I need to be able to choose whether or not to get vaccinated. And I don't feel safe getting vaccinated yet. And I don't trust the vaccination. And so my need is to wait. Those two things are in conflict if you're trying to be together. So you have limits on meeting their needs and expectations. I can't spend time with you in person if you're unvaccinated. And their limits, this is a little typo here, but their limits on meeting your needs and expectations are that they'll say, I won't get vaccinated until I feel that it's safe. Everybody here is setting boundaries that are appropriate for themselves. And as I mentioned, a lot of times what holds us back from boundaries is either a fear of their reaction or a fear of your own reaction to this boundary. The fact is, it's really sad if you can't see somebody that you care about. And so there's going to be sadness associated with feeling this discomfort, associated with setting this boundary. That's inevitable. And the choice that you're making is how are you going to protect yourself from exceeding your limits, your real limits. Okay, so then there's also this challenge when boundaries collide, that sometimes boundaries and manipulation can be confusing. So the reason why they can be confusing is that setting a boundary and being manipulative can often look externally exactly the same. So for instance, not attending a gathering because you truly won't be comfortable there is setting a boundary. But not attending a gathering because you want to punish the other person for their choices, that's manipulative. The external view of that is the same. In both cases, you're not attending the gathering. Only you know in your heart of hearts whether what is causing you to do that is a respect for yourself and your own limitations, or whether you are trying to punish the other person, whether you are trying to manipulate them. In your heart of hearts, you will know the difference, but the two look very similar externally. If you end a conversation because you're emotionally saturated and you need a break, that is a boundary. But if you are ending the conversation because you want to communicate to the other person that they've done something you don't like and you want them to feel guilty about it, that is manipulative. And so those two things are externally the same, ending the conversation, but one is a real boundary and the other is manipulation. And then unfollowing or unfriending somebody on social media because you find their posts upsetting or unsettling. They're constantly posting about vaccination in a way that is in conflict with your point of view. If you're really upset and unsettled by it, then removing it from your ecosystem is a good idea. It's just setting a clear boundary and being honest about your own limitations. But unfollowing or unfriending someone because you want to teach them a lesson, that again is not about you acknowledging your own limitations. It's about you trying to control them. And again, those two things can look really similar externally, but they internally are very different. So when we talk about when we talk about this idea of assuming positive intentions, one of the things that we can do in our vaccine conversations is assume that when there's ambiguity about whether somebody is setting a boundary or manipulating us, we can assume that they're setting a boundary. If somebody suddenly ends a conversation, we can assume that they need to do that in order to attend to their own needs, that they're emotionally saturated and that they needed to end the conversation, that they're not punishing us because they don't like what we've said. So you can use this ambiguity as a way of trying to, whenever possible, assume positive intent in the conversation and try to imagine, how is this person trying to hold a boundary? How could that possibly explain their behavior in this conversation? Okay, so hopefully we have a sense of how to identify our our boundaries when it comes to vaccine conversations. But actually communicating those can still be challenging. And there's still this question of like the aftermath. It's really sad if you don't get to visit with your family because you've set a boundary around what you're comfortable with in terms of the parameters of that visit, and they've set a boundary saying that they're not willing to do those things. That can be really sad. How do you deal with that? Okay, so let's start with communicating it. First things first, you got to be direct. A lot of times when we have boundaries, we expect other people to know what our boundaries are, what our limitations are, but we don't actually communicate them. We expect them to be able to intuit what we need. And that's a recipe for an unhealthy relationship. When you are communicating your boundary, focus on your comfort rather than on right and wrong. And part of this is that the truth is that we all tend to shut down when someone suggests to us that we're being foolish or that we're being immoral. And so if you are expressing your boundary in a way that is saying like the other person is being foolish or immoral, that's not going to go over well. Just like this, if they did the same to you, you're not going to take that well. And so try to frame it within what you're comfortable with, what you need, what you expect. And don't feel like you have to explain that in a way that explicitly disagrees with their perspective. Just say, this is what you need. This is what you expect. Don't try to rationalize it, because rationalizing it is where you might start to get to a space where you're actually demeaning their point of view. When in doubt, you can use this formula to express your boundary. I feel, describe your feelings, when you, and then try to do a neutral description. So instead of when you hurt me, because that's hurting is a loaded word, you've already put a judgment on what the other person has done. Instead, say, when you say blah, 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 like as close to an objective description of what the other person has done as possible. So I feel when you, neutral or objective description of their behavior, and then state what you need. I need. And when you are communicating your boundaries, don't apologize. Being clear is being kind. There's no need to apologize for holding a boundary, for expressing the reality of your limitations. Okay, so what does this sound like? It could sound like any of these. Thank you for the invitation, but I'm uncomfortable planning travel with you until you're vaccinated. It's about comfort rather than right and wrong. I want you to stop asking me when I'm going to get vaccinated. You're describing your need. I want you to stop asking about that. You might say, I'm not in a good place to have this conversation right now. Can we talk about it tomorrow? Again, you're expressing your limitation and making a request. You can disagree with me without being mean or rude. A lot of times when we're talking with another person, they might say, oh, but that's such a stupid, that's such a stupid way of looking at it. Like, you're being you're being insensitive to the rest of the community, that sort of thing. And you can respond to that sort of thing that is really, if it feels like an attack, you can say, wait, you can disagree with me without being mean or rude. So you're setting up a boundary on the conversation itself. Another way would be, if you're curious, I'm happy to discuss my choices, but I won't continue this conversation if your intention is to prove me wrong or to make me feel bad about my decisions. Right? Because if somebody wants to get to know you better and understand more about what you're doing and why, great, you'll talk about it. But if they're just looking for you to explain yourself so that they can attack your explanation, that's a really different situation. And you may not be willing to opt into a conversation that's going like that. That may not be the conversation you want to have. Okay. So then when you set these boundaries, you have to confront the short-term discomfort for the long-term benefits of boundary setting. And what will those short-term discomfort, what will that short-term discomfort look like? How will it manifest? Well, in the other person, it is common for another person to respond with pushback or rationalizing of why you're wrong to hold the boundary. They might ignore your boundary or test your boundary. They might cut you off entirely and be silent about it, or give you the silent treatment. Those are all things that could happen. So two things. One is, sometimes that is a response, the result of an emotional response that somebody is having to a change that they're experiencing. You were uncomfortable seeing them, but you didn't speak up. And now you're speaking up and setting a boundary, and they don't like the change. And so they're reacting and having an emotional response. We all, you and me, we all have ways of reacting that are not the healthiest sometimes. And sometimes you need to give people time and space to integrate a new reality into their life. And you just need the consistency. And just because they responded poorly in the moment doesn't mean that they won't come around. So there's a little bit of faith there that's necessary. But they may not come around. And if they don't come around, then that's a sign that it never was a healthy relationship in the first place, that there was something really toxic about that relationship. And so it's useful to get to a point of clarity about that. So oftentimes people come around, and if they don't, it's useful information that that is not a really positive, healthy, constructive relationship. Then you might experience in this space of, having set a boundary, you might experience grief or sadness, you might experience guilt, and you might experience self-doubt. And these are all things like when people are trying to figure out how to be better at setting boundaries, often one of the most common questions is, how do I avoid feeling guilty? How do I not feel guilty? How do I not feel sad? How do I stay confident? Well, if somebody asks, how do I avoid feeling guilty? Just know, ridding yourself of guilt is saying that you want to, sorry, this is a typo, rid yourself of emotions. The more you focus on the guilt and try to stop it, the longer it will linger. Just feel, don't judge what you feel. The fact is that we oftentimes feel guilt, and that's okay. Just allow yourself to feel the guilt. Eventually it will pass. You may feel sadness. Allow yourself to feel the sadness. That we can't avoid the fact that holding boundaries is hard. The question is the short-term discomfort worth the long-term comfort of having your boundaries actually respected, of having your limitations, your needs, and your expectations met? Be curious, not judgmental. This we say a lot in this series, and generally speaking, we are referring to being curious about other people's point of view, not judgmental of it. But this can equally be directed at ourselves. When you are feeling this sense of feeling guilty or doubting the boundary that you just set, get curious about that. Don't judge yourself for feeling guilty. Don't judge yourself for feeling sad. Just be curious about it. Allow yourself to consider changing your mind, and allow yourself to consider that, maybe it's hard, but it's still worthwhile. And so one way to manage through emotions is to just get curious about them. Where is that coming from? And sometimes it's not just that other people don't understand us, it's that we don't understand ourselves. So setting boundaries is a whole learning process. And along the way, you're going to feel a lot of things. And sometimes those feelings are going to help you to see that maybe you want to change your mind. And other times those feelings are going to tell you, nope, it's uncomfortable, but it's worth every bit of that discomfort for the long term benefits. Okay, so before we get into the Q&A, I just want to say that constructive boundary settings, and we're on constructive boundary setting for vaccine conversations. All of this stuff is all well and good, but the fact is it's hard to do. Boundaries are a practice. They're not something that you learn and then now you've got it. It's something that you have to keep refreshing and doing over and over and over again. Everybody, even the most experienced, experts on boundaries, they need to work on this as a practice. And so we will be practicing it next week. Then we'll talk about questions, how to ask better questions in our vaccine conversations. We'll do it as a webinar, and then we'll do it as a workshop. And we've been doing this series for a while. So in mid-April, we'll share with all of you what we've learned along the way, because this is a learning process for us as much as it is for you. And with that, I will move to the Q&A. Before we go into the Q&A, one of the things that I want to just preface this with is please, 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 please frame your question in a way that is respectful of all viewpoints when it comes to vaccination. We have no idea how people feel in this room necessarily about vaccination. And so we want to make sure that we are respectful in our questioning. Also, just let us know who you are and where you're from when you're asking the question. With that, I will pass it to Odd to manage the Q&A.
Thank you, Megan. So Dawn, I know you had put into the chat that I think I need help understanding other people's boundaries, which so often resemble 1, a wall, 2, a minefield, and then 3, a labyrinth. Megan, do you have any insight regarding that?
First, let me just ask Dawn, do you want to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's just, the conversation, and this is, this is like any kind of topic, because a lot of times it's, you're just trying to get information from them is like overstepping their boundaries. And it's like, I've asked people, why do you feel that way? Well, do your own research. Or, just trying to get information. Or it's like, well, I don't want to talk about it, but you just do your thing, and we have a difference of opinion. And it's like, or the famous phrase is, well, we'll just have to agree to disagree. It's like, well, you're just shutting down conversation. We're not agreeing to disagree anything. And usually that term to me is usually said by somebody who's about to lose the argument, and they're going to hold on to whatever thread of that they can. So it's really hard, to have that or navigate their minefield of feelings when anything you say or suggest becomes offensive to them. And it's like,
yeah, so I think that there's 2 things that this connects to. One is that concept of rigid boundaries. And so sometimes, because of things that people have experienced in the past, they develop these really, really rigid boundaries that are so strict, they're counterproductive to the relationship. And, the best thing to do in that, best is probably, I'm overselling it here. One thing you can do in response to that is just think about how you can articulate the need that you have that's not being met, right? And then articulate that. And so, one of the things you could say is, when you say we agree to disagree, so use that framing, like, when you do this, I feel I feel sad. I feel like you're letting the conversation go, because, and I really need to feel like it's possible to talk about these things with you as my friend or something like that. Like that is one way to respond, is by just articulating clearly what is the need that you have that's not being met when they do that. The other thing that this makes me think about is that idea that of assuming positive intent, by assuming sometimes that people may be holding a boundary, may be expressing a limitation, instead of thinking that they're manipulating you, right? So like if somebody says, let's agree to disagree, you could imagine the reason they're doing that is because they want to shut down the conversation and show me that they are frustrated with me and they're trying to teach me not to bring this up. That's one way of seeing it. Another way to see it is to say like, ooh, sounds like they're emotionally saturated. They've reached their own limits in this conversation and they need to take a break. And so another way is to just kind of interpret that as positively as possible, as the person kind of running up against their own limitations and doing the best that they can to express that. The other thing that this makes me think about, this question makes me think about, is this idea that when the person says, let's agree to disagree, is essentially that I've completely lost my train of thought there. Maybe it'll come back to me. Sorry. But yeah, just to summarize, it could be that they've developed rigid boundaries. It could be that they're kind of in a roundabout way expressing a boundary, a limitation that they've come up against. So do we have another question? Oh, looks like Travis.
Yeah, Travis, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question as well.
Awesome. Thank you. I think it's not so much a question as a comment. First and foremost, thank you so much for this. This is vastly exceeded my expectations. I'm so happy that I made time for this today. One of the things that I just wanted to comment on is that in general, I find that when you're having any conversation about a belief structure or anything that a person believes in, as soon as the defense mechanisms go up, it's over. And so what I've found in experience from a variety of different settings that is applied to this is you're seeing a person and they're like a multifaceted crystal. And if your goal in the conversation is to get the person to say, I'm going to get up and go get the shot, that is not going to work for some of the people that are embattled and they're dug into this. And so one of the things that I just a brief vignette into this, I recently had a conversation with the person I didn't know through an online gaming environment. And they informed me that they had a couple of kids. And in the conversation, this gentleman mentioned that he would not get vaccinated. And he used very strong language about that. And my gut reaction was to have a very visceral, very upset kind of overt reaction. And I just found myself in the calm enough mind state to step back and ask questions that were not leading, but they were just general questions about, oh, why is this the case? And this individual I was talking with was incredibly willing to answer me. And he was not angry with me. He was not upset. He was willing to engage on this. And we got to a point where I asked him, he basically had noted that his son had been exposed through friends of the family, and his wife, who is a care provider, was taking them. They were both going to get tested at the moment we were having this conversation. And I said to him, well, if you got really sick, would you go to the hospital? And he said, probably not. I said, well, what if your son said to you, Dad, I'm having a tough time breathing? And he paused long enough for me to know that that was the best I could have ever done in that situation. And it's not about him coming out of that saying, you're right, I was wrong, I'm getting vaccinated. It's a kernel of thought. It's a seed that gets planted, and it may never root, but it is a chance for that person to come to terms with a question that is outside of their structure, the logical structure they've provided for this. So that's just my feedback on this. It's a fascinating framework to look at the boundaries and see the boundaries of another person in this kind of reflective light. And my only comment is just this idea of thinking about goals and how far you can move the needle in a person that does have a lot of really adverse and potentially unscientific, unsupported viewpoints. So that's just something to think about, and avoid the reactions, the visceral reactions as much as possible. But thank you again so much for this. I took a ton of notes. This was wonderful. And thank you, Aude, for coordinating this.
Travis, I really appreciate what you're saying. And you provoked the third thing that I was thinking about in response to Dawn's question, because 100% agree. Our other webinars have talked a lot more about this idea of shifting our goals with regards to conversations, and how it's unrealistic to imagine that somebody is going to change a really deeply held belief over the course of a single or even many conversations. That kind of change takes a lot of time. And often when we try to change a person's mind, it backfires. They dig in a lot more. And so two things. One is that often the best you can hope for is just instilling just a little kernel of doubt about a person's point of view. And Don, the last thing you said in your question was, sometimes it feels like the person's just starting to be a little bit challenged, a little bit, they're maybe even getting to the point that they can't argue with you anymore because they don't know how to respond. And that's when they cut off the conversation. And that reaction, while it feels like they're shutting down, it could be exactly that hint that they've got a kernel of doubt that feels a little bit threatening. And so maybe that is a good time to walk away, because they'll sit with that doubt afterwards a little bit. And them shutting that down is a hint. Now, that's not always going to be the case. And so I don't want to, but like, that's another frame to look at that reaction from too.
Okay. Well, we have reached the conclusion of the webinar, and I just want to remind everyone that we have the workshop that is correlating with the webinar next Thursday, March 2nd, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. I'll send out information on that, as well as the recording for this session as well. And so that next workshop will be Constructive Boundary-Setting for Vaccine Conversations. But thank you, Don, Travis, for attending, and thank you, Megan, for facilitating.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you again so much.